Welcome, everybody. Okay, let's get underway. Welcome, everybody, to our panel on innovation in the energy transition and Australia's net zero and energy superpower journey. We have a really wonderful panel here today that Darren Miller, the ARENA CEO, will introduce shortly. My name's Justin Punch. I'm the chair of the Australian Renewable Energy Agency. And again, we're delighted to have all of you here, and we're delighted to have our panel here today to explore these really interesting topics. Some people think about the energy transition and climate change in particular as a tragedy of the commons problem. I find it more useful to think of it more as a very wicked prisoner's dilemma problem. Costs to play, a big prize for cooperating, but in some insidious incentives because of the nature of the way that costs are borne locally and benefits shared globally. It's some insidious incentives not to cooperate. I think in that game, there are two imperatives for us all to pursue. One is to overcome those insidious incentives and disincentives and to cooperate. Other parties must know that if they do the right thing, that we will too, and vice versa. And in that respect, I want to congratulate the government on its announcements yesterday for its contributions to the Pacific Resilience Facility and to the Green Climate Fund. Important steps in this compact between us all to cooperate to come to the best collective outcome. The other thing that we all have to do is we must reduce the costs of the game. And that brings us to our topic today of innovation. We have to innovate technologically, we have to innovate in terms of how we approach the regulatory challenges, the commercialisation challenges, all sorts of different aspects. The energy transition must work for energy consumers, it must work for taxpayers, it must work for regional remote communities, and it must work for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the Australian context, on whose land much of the energy transition will occur. So to explore all of these topics, we will have our exciting and dynamic panel shortly. Before that, though, I'd like to introduce Australia's Minister for Climate Change and Energy, the Honourable Chris Bowen, MP.
Well, thank you very much, Justin. And of course, while we meet many thousands of kilometres from the traditional lands of Australia, I do pay my respects to First Nations people who are present and thank them for the stewardship of their and our land over millennia. And as Justin said, it's important that First Nations people are an integral part of our transition as the traditional owners of so much of the land which we're working on and with as part of this revolution, the clean energy revolution. Well, I'm delighted to be here to kick off this panel on Australia's renewable energy superpower ambitions and the role of innovation within those ambitions. It's a very good panel, and of course ARENA is one of the key institutions in making that ambition a reality to become a renewable energy superpower. As I said, it's an impressive panel, but if you just wouldn't mind if I just single out one panellist and thank my friend Sir Alok Sharma for being here today. As you know, Sir Alok was the reason why COP26 was a success. He was no small part of COP27 not going off the rails behind the scenes, working very assiduously with like-minded colleagues to ensure that that was the case, and here he is again at COP28. He's Mr COP in many senses, or I should say Sir COP, for his role. He's since the last COP announced his retirement from active politics, but he has a very important contribution to make for many years into the future, I am sure, and I'm delighted to call him a friend, and I know he's a friend of Australia. I was delighted to host him recently in Australia as well. Well, our domestic ambitions are important. Reducing our emissions as a country, moving our country to 82% renewable by 2030, reducing emissions from our industrial and transport sectors, all important. I don't accept the argument that Australia is such a small emitter that we shouldn't bother. Yes, we are only 1% of emissions, but that's a fallacious argument. We are the 13th or 14th biggest emitter in absolute terms. That's like saying all the countries above us should do something and us and all the countries that are smaller emitters shouldn't bother. You know, we were 1% of the troops in World War II as well. They counted. It mattered. Everything matters in this important transformation. But I do accept that what's even more important is our role in helping the rest of the world decarbonise. With our sunlight and wind, more sunlight hits our country than any other country in the world, together with our above average wind resources. That makes us the most blessed country in the world for renewables. We have space, we have the sunlight, we have the wind, we have the skills, we have the labour force. We need a bit of capital, but we're getting that from the rest of the world. That's coming in. So we have an enormous opportunity to help those countries that don't have the sunlight, the wind, the room, the workforce to make it a reality. As so many countries in our region don't, think particularly of Singapore, with strong ambitions, but one thing Singapore lacks is room, and one thing renewable energy takes is room. And we can help, whether it's through sun cable or hydrogen exports in due course, whatever it is, we can help. So when you take our potential as a renewable energy superpower, our role in international decarbonisation is so much more than that 1% of emissions that we are responsible for. So both are important. And innovation is important to get us there. We won't get there without it. And as I said earlier, with our friend Leonora Gewessler, the Austrian minister, when she and I were delivering awards to innovators, one of the leading innovators in the world, Dr. Purohit from the CSIRO, who won the award. Very proud of that, very proud an Australian won, even though we were giving the awards. There was no fait accompli that an Australian was going to win. That innovation which she is pioneering, Dr. Purohit, on green iron and decarbonising iron production, for example, is just one of the things when I see so many examples of that around the country, as I see universities, corporations, private and public sector all in on innovation. There are plenty of technologies we know exist and just need to be commercialised, and there's plenty of technologies which are still emerging, all of which will be key to our ambitions to be a renewable energy superpower. So I'm very pleased and thank ARENA for everything they do, but for setting this panel up as well. I'm very pleased to kick it off. I then have to leave for a consultation with the Executive Secretary of the UNFCCC on current state of negotiations, so you'll forgive me for leaving. But I did want to just kick this session off because it is important to me, and I thank you all for being part of it tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you, Justin, and welcome everybody. My name is Darren Miller. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of ARENA, Australia's Renewable Energy Innovation Agency. And I added that word innovation, even though it's not in the title, because that is what we're all about here today. We're here to drive the technologies forward so that we have the options at low cost to deliver on this ambition, both to reduce our emissions and the superpower imperative. So let me invite the panel members up one at a time. That'll just make it in the right order and I can introduce each of you. So I might start with Sir Alok Sharma, who I checked with, and he's happy to be called Alok. So please, Alok, can you come up to stage? As you heard from the Minister, Alok was the COP26 president, and I first had a good session watching Alok while I was sitting on the plane in Glasgow on my way home to Australia, and that very poignant and emotional moment of phase out or phase down was being televised live, and I think I shed a tear, as did Alok at the time, and we'd love to explore how we might improve on that in this COP and perhaps in future ones. Next, I'd like to introduce Michael Liebreich. Michael, come up, Michael, thank you. Maybe one in the middle there. That's it, I'll put Anna over there. Michael, I'm pleased to say, is a friend of mine now, and I first met Michael when he was coming to a Bloomberg conference in Sydney about 10 years ago, and I hadn't met him yet, and we were going down to the rocks, and this gentleman who I recognised from the photos was gesticulating strangely with his iPhone on the pavement at the rocks, and I went up to check if he was okay, and he said, "No, I'm fine, I'm just collecting Pokemon for my daughter." So, Michael, that was our first interaction, and we've caught up at COPs and other events since. Delighted to have you here. Many of you would know Michael as a very respected analyst, researcher, commentator on the energy transition, having established New Energy Finance many years ago and sold that to Bloomberg and was operating as the CEO there for a number of years. Michael is now one of my favourite podcasters. It's just long enough for me to get around Centennial Park at a fast pace, and I get through one of your podcasts. And obviously people know Michael as a leading thinker on hydrogen. Some might say a skeptic, and I say a realist and a person who talks truth about the true opportunities and economics of these technologies, and delighted to explore that with you today, Michael. Next, I'd like to introduce Anna Freeman. Anna, please come up and take a seat between Anna Freeman is the Policy Director of Decarbonisation at the Clean Energy Council. The Clean Energy Council is Australia's peak body for the renewables industry, with representation of 1,000 members across solar, wind, hydro, batteries and hydrogen. Anna leads the CEC's policy and industry development work for the decarbonisation agenda and has the strong desire to help support Australia to be a renewable energy superpower. And finally, Richard Payne. Please come up, Richard. Richard is the CEO of Raygen, one of Australia's most promising clean tech startup companies, and really delighted to have Richard here today to really represent the innovation space in this panel. And as Richard would acknowledge, that it's taken a decade for Raygen to become an overnight success. And those of you who know what Raygen's technology does, which is store the sun's energy and dispatch it overnight, would get the dad joke, which is for my son and daughters on the camera. The overnight success being the storage of energy for success in a superpower world. Had to explain that one. Richard is a wonderful CEO and leader of this important company. And I'm sure Richard will talk about the story as well, but ARENA has funded Raygen through various innovation cycles over almost a decade now. 6 different projects, $38 million of funding, and real success would be success of Raygen, and that ARENA is no longer required to help facilitate your future success. And I'm delighted in the progress you're making and really look forward to a bright future, there he goes again, with Raygen and many of our other technology companies. So I'm going to take a seat and we're going to ask some questions and get the show going. Thank you. So I'd like to start with you, Alok, and ask you to talk us through what's happened in the climate mitigation policy space since Glasgow and how you're feeling about the whole negotiations at this point in time.
Well, thank you. So firstly, can I thank ARENA for inviting me to this? And I spoke to Justin upstairs and I said, well, Justin, what do you actually want me to say on this panel? He said, look, we've got 4 really super bright technologists, and we thought we needed a politician to balance the whole thing up. Thank you for inviting me. Look, I mean, what's changed is, and I think this goes to the heart of what all of these negotiations are about here, right? So for me, there are a lot of people who will tell you that these COPs don't matter, they're just talking shops. But actually the political signal that is sent from every COP, both to governments, but also to business and to civil society, is really important in terms of setting the direction. And what, of course, then happens, or certainly should happen, is that what is agreed here at an international forum should then translate into domestic policy. So I think I mean, let me take a sort of one example. So last year, I think you made mention of the phase down, or 2 years ago, phase down of coal. Actually, if you have a look, this year we've had the US joining the Powering Past Coal Alliance. Just a few months ago, India announced that there was going to be a moratorium, 5-year moratorium on new coal plants coming online. So I think there is a connection between what is agreed at these sort of events and what transpires into domestic policy. So in terms of the outcomes that I want to see from this particular COP, I think obviously we want to see outcomes on finance, but also on clean energy. And yes, there's been the discussion around tripling renewables and doubling energy efficiency. I think all of that will come. But I think the key issue here is going to be on the phase out of fossil fuels. And I think we have to accept that given that 75% of all emissions globally are energy related, if you want to cut emissions by over 40% by 2030 to keep on track for 1.5 degrees, you're going to have to address the issue of fossil fuel usage and production. And so if we get that language, and given who you talk to here, there are some sort of positive vibes about what the language might end up being. But what that needs to be accompanied with is an implementation plan. How are countries going to take what they agree here and implement that domestically? And by the way, can I just say one thing, and it'll be interesting to hear from the technologists, and then I'll shut up, which is there is a sort of school of thought that somehow technology will just sort of solve all of this in the next 6 years, that carbon capture storage will somehow help us cut these emissions. I'm sorry, I don't think that's going to happen, because whilst it is key technology and it's good for hard-to-abate sectors, not cheap enough, not being rolled out fast enough, and therefore you have to address the issue of production and usage.
Great. So, Alok, before I move on, I might just ask you, how do you see, I mean, the panel discussion is about innovation, and it's about scientists and engineers and startups taking ideas and putting them into the market. How does this kind of conference, which is at such a high level, frankly, I described Glasgow as everyone walking around with thesauruses under their arms, trying to find the right word. How does that, what's the relationship between that very high level policy ambition and the UNFCCC process and the startups? What can they get out of this process?
Yeah, so I mean, look, I think COP26 was what many people describe as the first business COP, and I'm very proud of that. I mean, for me, it was really important that, alongside these very important but frankly sometimes opaque negotiations, and exactly as you said, you're looking for sort of, playing on with words, to actually kind of the business community, which is then having to deliver this. It was very important to have that, and we've got this here. The business community is here in spades. But again, for me, what's very important is that when countries agree to something here, you need to translate that into domestic policy in terms of, firstly, if you're going to agree to triple the amount of renewables capacity, what are you doing about your grids, right? What are you doing about planning rules to allow green projects to be fast-tracked? What are you doing in terms of incentives so that the innovators can actually get a leg up from government? And we've seen examples of that around the world. I mean, in the UK, we've had something called the Contracts for Difference auction process, which allowed us to build out the second biggest offshore wind sector in the world. So I think that is the connection, is you have the innovators here, but the governments then need to go back and find ways of incentivizing that technology and allowing them to succeed.
Great. Anna, I might turn to you and just ask you, in terms of Australia's energy transition, what are you seeing as the key policy and technology innovations? I know we're talking about innovation here, but I'm going to extend the definition to be not just technology, but it's policy, it's regulations, business models, commercial models. What are the key innovations that you're seeing on the positive side? And then also on the other side, what are you concerned about that's holding us back from these ambitions?
I think a lot of this is not going to be news to you, Darren. Well, I think at the end of the day, we've got to unlock our renewable energy force. It's a beast that we can awaken over time, and I think one of the exciting things that's happening in Australia at the moment is, and where we really are at the cutting edge, is on integration of large amounts of renewables, variable renewables, into the grid. It's something where because we've got such a historically weak grid, long, skinny grid, we've had to confront some challenges, probably at the leading edge, that many other countries haven't necessarily had to grapple with in the way that where they're better connected than we are. We are a massive continent, very low population, and not connected anywhere on Earth to the Earth. So we're in a position where we really have to cope with this on our own. We have to manage that very high level of renewables in the grid, and we've got some reasonable hydro, but we're not blessed in the way that other regions of the world are, like Norway, with that hydropower. So system strength, for example, is an area that we've had to grapple with over time, and it's something that means that, the grid operators in Australia are really at the leading edge of trying to understand how we can get to very high levels of renewables, variable renewables on our grid at the moment. So things like grid-forming batteries that that ARENA has been at the forefront of trying to help bring online some new cutting-edge technologies and softwares so that we can actually manage that penetration in the grid.
So just to follow up, we've obviously got our own emissions reduction ambitions and trajectory, and that's our domestic emissions, 500 million tonnes, give or take, have to go to zero. On the other hand, we talk about the renewable energy superpower, which is, many times more energy than that to produce hydrogen or ammonia or upgrade iron into green iron. Do these two ambitions go together, or are they entirely separate things that we need to tackle differently? How do you and your members think about that local opportunity and imperative, but then the global opportunity at the same time?
Look, I think the domestic decarbonisation of the grid, so we've got the national electricity market, which runs right down the east coast through to South Australia and down to Tasmania, and so Western Australia isn't part of the national electricity market. But I don't know anyone that would think that we can do superpower without decarbonising our own grid. In fact, that's obviously not the plans of the government. The government hopes to get to very high levels, or aspires to get to very high levels of renewable energy penetration across the grid within 6 to 7 years. So 82% by 2030. But I think everyone would think that we had things around the wrong way if we were just trying to meet our potential opportunities on hydrogen exports or ammonia production and green iron, etc., without decarbonising. So I think there is a strong sense that we need to be able to do both at the same time, and hopefully the lessons from the decarbonisation of the main electricity grid will be very instrumental for that broader story. But a lot of that renewable energy superpower story may actually happen off the main grid. It might be in remote areas in which they're not actually benefiting from that grid connectivity.
Absolutely, thank you. Michael, I might turn to you and just ask you, how is the world doing on climate mitigation? I think emissions are probably at a record level, after rebounding after COVID, and everyone's trying to predict when that peak might come and when we start bending the curve down. And it feels enormously frustrating that just hasn't happened yet, and we need to go quickly. And yet we've got all this innovation, this deep tech on solar and hydrogen. I know you're on the advisory board of Hysata. There's such momentum there at that startup space. Is it going to happen? I mean, is that force of that technology about to break through, or are we really just stuck at the moment?
No, so first of all, thank you very much for the invitation and the kind words so far. We'll see how we do at the end. But, we are pretty much at peak emissions. We're very close to peak emissions. And in fact, if you include land use, the data is that, not my data, but real data is that we've probably been at flat emissions for about 10 or 12 years. So this is Global Carbon Project figures. In energy, emissions have been going up for the last 7 or 8 years at about 0.4% per year, which is still going up, and it's the wrong direction, and it's terrible. But the economy is growing at sort of 3.5%. So we are decoupling. So the good news, it's too easy to be negative and say, oh, the emissions keep growing, and we grown-ups are doing nothing, and so that's not actually what's happening. It's not correct. So the innovation, and your broad definition of innovation is the right one. The innovation is working, it's just not working fast enough. So we are very, very close to seeing that peak, and I've got no doubt that we'll see it this decade, before 2030, because I just look around and all the players that I see innovating, doing, and I'm talking about the big emitters, company after company is finding opportunities to reduce their emissions. I hate to say it, but it's just not that hard. And so those projects will come through. I would imagine by 2030, the problem is that we'll be down something like, let's say, 10% on the peak, 5%, 10%. Nowhere near enough for the 1.5 degrees. So that's the good news is it's happening because of innovation, because of what's coming through the pipeline. But the bad news is it is nowhere near fast enough.
So, yeah, I mean, that's terrifying because the world doesn't care how fast we want to grow. It just cares about how many CO2 molecules are roaming around the atmosphere. So what can we do to speed that up? What are we missing here?
So I have to be careful here because I'm personally, if you look at I'm sitting next to, Sir 1.5 alive, right? So I can't say I haven't believed that since about 2018. I think we're going to blow through the 1.5 degrees. I just hate to say that. Will we, in the second half of the century, then, reel that back in and get back to 1.5? If we have to, I think we will. But nevertheless, there's a lot that we can do to speed up because it doesn't. If we miss 1.5, then we do 1.6 or we do 1.7. Every single 0. Whatever matters. So what we can do, I spend a lot of my time myth busting, using the platform that I've built, and myth busting, and quite often, sadly, myth busting about clean energy technologies that are sucking the oxygen out of the debate and attracting too much attention for what they can deliver. And what they can deliver between now and 2030. And the answer is, what can we do? Well, we can do more of the things that are working and a small number of innovations at scale that can really make a difference and can make a difference in that time frame. And we can also refuse to be distracted by the kind of, there's a whole bunch of technologies being promoted very much in the interests of some players, but that will not really substantially accelerate what we really care about, which is just that emissions curve, and just bending that arc down. And so, I guess that's how I try to spend my time, I guess.
So to sort of play that back to you, I guess one way to think about it is your desire is for us to optimize our human, financial, and temporal capital, if you like, to solve the problem.
Yeah, look, I think there's a lot of people say, we must try everything. It's so urgent, we must try everything. Even the stuff that kind of quite obviously is not going to work. And I don't see any point in that. I think we should be putting our talent, above all, our resources, our efforts, our political capital for those of us in the political space, behind stuff that works at scale or that has a chance of. So I'm not saying don't do small modular reactors or don't do fusion, but don't position fusion as a 2050 solution of any sort that's going to be helpful. It's certainly not a 2030 solution, can forget that. But, we've just got to be really clear-eyed about, and there are so many, we're not having a discussion at all about, I don't know, if I can sort of shoehorn it into the innovation discussion, geographical innovation. In other words, deindustrialization, right? Because here we talk about green steel, and by the way, I'm going to claim Renewable Superpower was one of mine. But Australia, Renewable Superpower, it has to be one of the cheapest places in the world to make green steel. But that has implications in Japan and Austria and Germany and Sweden and everywhere else, which are not being discussed. Right? So the deindustrialization, none of the IEA models talk about how industries are going to move around the world, which could be one of the biggest drivers of decarbonization. It's not in any of their models because it's politically unacceptable to talk about deindustrialization. So I'm trying to push in lots of different dimensions, not just to kind of promote an innovation, a tech innovation. HySATA is fantastic Australian technology, right? Proud to be associated with it, but it can only do so much. And there's a whole bunch of other discussions where we need to kind of, I don't know, suck the nonsense out of it and just get down to what do we really need to do? What are the 5 or 6 big things that we need to do that will really bend that curve and get, my 5 to 10% down to 25, 30, 40% and more that's needed to keep, if we want to keep 1.5 alive, 1.5 alive, or at least to do what Paris said, which is substantially under 2, because right now we're on track for 2.5.
Great, well thank you. I'm going to come back to you a bit later and ask you for what those 5 to 6 things are for Australia, so that'll give you time to think about that. But I'm going to turn to you, Richard, and as the representative of the innovators, if you like, the literal idea on the board there, I'd love you to tell your story, I know it well obviously, to the audience about what does RayGen do, but more importantly, how did you get there? Because these journeys are never easy, and you've been at it for a while, and I think it's really intriguing.
Yeah, thanks, Darren. Certainly it hasn't been easy. Developing hardware technology is not for the faint-hearted, I would say. So we were founded in 2010 and by Dr. John Lassick, who had an idea for developing the lowest cost solar generation technology, which you can see the image behind you there, Darren. So we were on track to do that. Because we use low-cost materials in just glass and steel to generate electricity, and that we have developed a module which is generating both electricity and heat in the form of simple hot water. And so in 2019, we're developing this technology. We're on track to beat solar PV, but as we saw in the Australian market, the value of that electricity in the middle of the day is dropping. As more and more rooftop solar and large-scale solar plants are being deployed, we had to transform and innovate, and that is where we came up with a storage solution, which was effectively using the waste heat, a byproduct heat, which came from the module. I've got a module here with me. So this is a high-tech module that we've developed over many years. It uses satellite-grade photovoltaic cells, which come from the satellite industry. And this module, together with the concentrated light that hits it, is generating 2.5 kilowatts of electricity and 5 kilowatts of thermal energy simply in the form of hot water. And it's that hot water which we store during the day as we're collecting that thermal energy, storing it, and then we're dispatching it to the grid in the night when it's needed most. And I think having the company transform itself and innovate on the spot was very important, but we also went to the market and secured great support from one of Australia's largest utilities in AGL, who helped provide the voice of the customer. And I think in that innovation journey, that's critical. You need to, as deep engineering companies, you sometimes try and make things as efficient as possible, and that's not the objective. You have to deliver a commercial reality, and having a customer like AGL provide the voice into that was really important. And so then we effectively took that technology to market. We secured some substantial support from investors such as AGL, a global technology company in Schlumberger, now rebranded as SLB, two global energy majors in Equinor and Chevron, and then a project development company in Photon Energy. And we built the commercial demonstration project together with the support of ARENA. And I think it's worthwhile, Darren, just to highlight the importance of ARENA during that journey. And in fact, many of those international investors that we've secured have actually said to us, how can we replicate the ARENA model in our own countries? Because ARENA has brought deep expertise, and they brought a lot of confidence to private investors to come behind the company to deliver the technology. And so that technology, that we're now scaling out that technology to deliver much larger projects. Fundamentally, our storage medium is simply water. So it's structurally the lowest cost storage medium. It avoids all of the raw material constraints in nickel, cobalt, lithium. We know there's great demand for those. We need lithium ion. It's a critical technology, but we also need other technologies that can deliver long duration energy storage. And that project behind Darren there on the wall, that has 17 hours of storage.
Richard, thank you. The one thing I learnt from your colleague Kira yesterday, which intrigued me, is because it's such a specialised module that you've got there, if you are successful, which I am hopeful and confident you will be, you will actually absorb very quickly the world's supply of these very specialised space-grade solar cells. So how do you think about the supply constraint in the materials side, the manufacturing of that, and by implication, and I'll ask you this, Michael, as well, the minerals that we need for this energy transition, and they're in different places and in different forms to what we're used to digging up and refining. How do you think about that problem of global supply chains and manufacturing capability, and what are you thinking about as the solution there?
Yeah, it's a great question, Darren. So that is, when we look at the module, we have 4 square metres of that satellite-grade cells to deliver a megawatt of electricity, compared to typically 6,000 square metres of silicon PV panels. So ultimately it reduces the material consumption substantially of sort of specialist materials. But as you point out, it's effectively a cottage industry delivering satellite-grade cells. There's only a number of manufacturers across the globe who produce those cells. So whilst we're scaling our own module manufacturing facility, so this module we now produce, we've got Australia's largest solar module manufacturing facility at 170 megawatts per annum. It's very low cost capital to scale, but we do need to be able to produce those cells. So we think there's a fantastic opportunity to bring the satellite industry to Australia and actually support the manufacturing of these special cells to deliver effectively to the terrestrial applications and help address the energy transition.
So, Michael, if I can ask you to comment on that, these specialised germanium cells doped with gallium arsenide, should Australia be doing this, or should we be asking China to lift that load? How would you think about that challenge?
Let me just start out on a tangent. One of the point I want to sort of draw out of that is, this is why 2030 is tomorrow, right? Because developing that supply chain, whatever the answer to that specific question is, 2030 is tomorrow. In 2000, I think it was 18, I wrote a piece called 2 Business Cycles Till 2030. Because when you're doing a business, it takes, you have to sort of make a decision, you build a factory, you do some stuff, you launch a product. That's 5 or 6 years, right? And then, back then, you had maybe 2 goes at it. If you screw up, you've got 1 more go. We are now 1 business cycle. There's 1 opportunity to go and persuade somebody to build a plant. If you can't persuade somebody to expand the capacity of that component, that's it. It's over, right? I mean, you can't scale. That's your bottleneck. And I'm not saying it to be critical. I'm just, there's a sort of reality of why things take time. Sorry.
No, I mean that's true. There is still capacity, in Germany, in China, and the US. I think the thing that I would like to raise is that Australia invented the photovoltaic cell. How many panels do we make, right? And this is an opportunity to bring a high-tech manufacturing to Australia where the technology was developed, and then benefit from that.
So, I think that opens up, though, a conversation about trade, the role of trade, and then we get it. So for the last 3 years, I've been on the UK Board of Trade, which was a huge, huge deal in the 17th, 18th century, 19th century, and it's just being rebuilt, post-Brexit. So I was on that as an advisor. I'm a huge believer in free trade. It may be that Australia is the best place to make those cells, but it may not be. And, I think it's very dangerous to load the need for clean energy technologies and to say, and then we must also use that as a way of revitalizing our manufacturing. I mean, there is an element of reshoring, but, if Europe, for instance, is not a good place to build batteries, and all the batteries come from Asia, forcing people to use European batteries or forcing, Australian companies to use Australian cells will drive up the cost of this transition and will slow it down. So there's an element of that reshoring that we can do, but if it becomes the primary goal, we will slow down climate action.
So, yeah, totally get that. I agree. But I think the thing that's happened more recently, and Alok, I might ask you just to share your thoughts on this, is we always had the COVID pandemic, which has really caused people to take stock of what they can do themselves and how they would react in a crisis, as well as emerging, now established, if you like, geopolitical risks around Russia and the Ukraine and the unfortunate war in the Middle East. So how is it a rational response for countries to sort of pull back a bit and say we need to do more of all these things ourselves, or when do we get back to that trusted, if there ever was a case, trusted geopolitical trading environment that helps this challenge in particular?
Yeah, so I was the UK's Business Energy Secretary during the COVID pandemic year, and my one reflection from that point was that when the chips are down, every country looks first to take care of themselves. I mean, that's just the nature of it. And, as a politician, you're elected by, your people and your your first instinct is to see, how can I deliver what is needed for my own population. And I think the other thing we saw was that supply chains became incredibly stretched. One, because of COVID, but then also because, certain countries were deciding they would, rather than send stuff out, would sort of keep it themselves. And so I think it's actually quite a natural reaction to that countries from a supply security perspective want to try and do more themselves. And obviously you're not going to be able to do absolutely everything yourself, but I'm pretty sure every government subsequent to COVID will have sat there and had a look at that sort of matrix of what it is that we could do ourselves. If we can't do it ourselves, instead of getting supplies from just one place, there are sort of 3 or 4 places we could get supply from. And actually the Inflation Reduction Act is the most sort of proactive response to that. Now, I know it's received a lot of criticism, certainly when it first came in from other countries. My personal view is that it is a really good piece of industrial policy. It is about getting investment into the US, and I think about 200 billion private sector investment has flowed in the last year as a result of that and other acts designed to attract inward investment. It's about jobs, and yeah, to a certain extent, it is about reshoring. So I don't think you can get away from that. But then the other side of it is that not every country can do everything. And so where, the UK and Australia, as the sort of closest as friends and like-minded in the Five Eyes, etc., can get together and cooperate, that actually makes a lot of sense as well.
Please, Anna.
I think it's very important that we remain an open economy and that we are encouraging that we are utilising global supply chains wherever we can. So I think it would be a mistake for us to think that we should be looking to supply ourselves within our transition. I know nobody is talking about us playing a very big role in terms of the supply chains in delivering all the supply that we'll need. But I think so. We need to take advantage of those global supply chains. Except, I would also say we shouldn't be prevaricating in terms of building our own capacity, because we know we're going to need a lot. Just the announcement by the government in the course of the last month. That's 23 gigawatts of variable renewables just for the 2030 goal. But, if you look ahead at some of those superpower forecasts of what Australia could require, some pieces of work are talking between 40 to 55 times the scale of Australia's current grid if we were to exploit our full superpower potential. It's very clear we're going to need a lot of new supply, and I think there are some areas, some components where it's going to make complete sense for that to be developed onshore. And I don't think there's any benefit in waiting. And so I think it's something that we're going to have to do. So we need to remain open to global supply chains, but at the same time, I think we should be looking to develop these as quickly as possible.
Just a really sort of quick response on that. So I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't be open to global supply chains, but I'm just telling you that as in democracies, as elected representatives, you have to respond to what is going on and what your population wants. And therefore, I think whether we like it or not, we will see, and actually it's a good thing, we will see obviously countries looking to do more themselves, but then I think you will start to see much closer cooperation with like-minded partners, just to ensure that you don't end up in a position where, the materials and the minerals you want are effectively controlled by someone who, may not be as like-minded, if I can put that diplomatically.
Yeah, let me... There's sort of two discussions going on here. One is around manufacturing, but the other is around minerals security. And I think it's worth separating, well, at least if I could focus a little bit on the minerals piece, because that's an area that Australia clearly has enormous strength. So if there is a drive to reshore or to de-risk particularly the reliance on China, which has got these huge market shares of everything in the solar value chain, the battery value chain, and all of the, the rare earth minerals and so on. So Australia, hugely well positioned in that space. It is not just about traditional mining, it is also about technological innovation, financial innovation, and so on. But I want to also, we're here at a COP, and one of the things we have to be very cognizant of is that if all the rich countries decide that they're going to be all clean, and they're going to move to these large amounts of renewable energy and figure out how to integrate them, and Europe's going to be net zero on track, US on track, Japan on track. But if we are doing that by pillaging nickel and copper, I also noticed that module you've got, a lot of copper in it. And if we're going to do that by pillaging countries like Papua New Guinea and Bolivia and so on, that is completely unacceptable. There is also there's a justice element. There's also an economic effectiveness element that we have to continue to. Those countries have absolutely legitimate requirements to bring their people out of poverty and integrate them into all the things we enjoy. So I think one of the things that we should also be doing is, as we increase the amount of copper, nickel, cobalt, tungsten, molybdenum, all of these materials, upskilling and making sure we're investing in some of the countries from which they come from, even where, and we have to find ways of doing that, it might not be comfortable from a pure finance perspective because of the risk, the perceived risk that goes along with that. And I think that we need to innovate along that axis as well. It's not necessarily technology, but really not just, as I say, not just taking the ores, but helping them to be players in anodes and cathodes. And these value chains, by the way, I also want to say, they are ferociously complex. It's very easy to think that, that there's that it's just silicon and glass, you make glass and steel. The chips that go into all of this stuff, we are dependent on companies we have never heard of that make components in the chip value chain and so on. So if we think that we're going to get there by sort of import substitution, we are absolutely, I'm afraid, kidding ourselves.
Richard, what do you think about all of that? I mean, you've got a wickedly complex supply chain, no doubt, with all of your components. Are you desperately committed to doing all of that in Australia, or are you open-minded as to where that takes place?
No, absolutely. A global supply chain is absolutely imperative for us. I think it's really looking at, in this case, it's really looking at just very specialised manufacturing, which would be fantastic to bring to Australia and bring some high-tech jobs as a result of this innovation that we've had. But I think on the point of the raw materials, I think the innovation needs to also be about looking at the CO2 footprint of producing all these raw materials and how they're processed, etc. And then I think a key element that we really never take into account is what's the CO2 footprint and the cost of recycling all of these materials. We get to 2050, if we think we're going to do it all with lithium ion, this is not going to happen, right? We need alternative technologies to this, but then when we get to there, we've got all these batteries that have degraded, and then we go, okay, now we have the cost of energy and the CO2 footprint to recycle, and then the whole process starts again. So I think it's a combination of things that we have to address, but I think we need to look at the cost of producing those raw materials into technologies as well.
Great, thank you. We have 10 minutes left, and I'm going to turn to the audience and ask if anyone has any questions. Please raise your hand. Tennant, who would have thought? Is it going to be about CBAM, Tennant? No? Okay, good.
No, different kind of policy question. So we've had policies that focus on just deploying more of the currently cheapest thing. We've had policies that focus on getting things that may be cheap in future but are very expensive now further along. What's the productive synthesis between those things? Because we've got myopia, we've also got the risk of policies that just, like infant industries that never grow up. So what's a good balance of getting, whether it's new forms of solar or hydrogen, getting them deployed so that they come down the cost curve, but then weaning them off the public funding over time? noting they're going to need a lot of it on the way through.
Yes, I mean, I think that's a really, really good point. And I mean, I talked earlier about the contracts for difference auction process for offshore wind. I mean, we have deployed that in the UK in new technologies. So we have different pots that you can bid into at different strike prices. So something that is much more developed will obviously have a lower strike price, but you know, some you know, innovative tidal technology, for instance, you know, the strike price will be set at a, you know, pretty high level. So it allows those companies to come in and actually, you know, build it out and know that they're going to get a return. And certainly for us, that has been one of the most innovative ways of actually getting money into technologies which are nascent, but you can see that there is absolutely a potential.
The answer is, I think you need both. There's no question, and you know, Mariana Mazzucato has done, the professor at UCL has done incredible work tracking where technologies come from, and a very surprising large proportion comes from state-funded R&D of one sort or another. There's no question to that. The original, where the technologies come from, but equally, the private sector is phenomenally good at applications, at innovating around business models and getting the stuff out there. And so there has to be this shift. It's, you know, the idea that because a technology, you know, originated in a national lab, therefore the state should own it and the state should roll it out is completely false. What was fantastic about there were about 10 years ago, 2014, 15, there was this great move, and I was pushing very hard for it, for price signals. To, as soon as you get into that space of rolling things out, price signals really matter, because the private sector needs price signals to allocate capital. And what we did in the UK was to move, Brazil started it, has to be said, moving to reverse auctions. And what we saw, Bloomberg NEF, and Kobad sitting in the audience, you'll remember this, we looked at everywhere in the world. When you move from a feed-in tariff, which is essentially state pricing, to a reverse auction, which reveals a price, the cost of clean energy dropped by 50% over the subsequent 3 years. And we saw it right around the world, 50% reduction. So the answer to your question is we need to do both. The state needs to be pump priming with the new technologies. Maybe it's fusion, maybe it's whatever it's going to be. Keep that engine going, but then needs to be releasing these technologies into the wild and designing policy that reveals the price signal. And that needs to be a temporal price. What value is something worth at this time of day or in this evening or when it rains or whatever it is. Geographical prices. What is this resource worth in this particular location, near to a wind farm, near to the sea, near to wherever? It's very granular. The more you can get these price signals moving through the system, the more the private sector is unleashed as a force of innovation. And that piece is very uncomfortable to a lot of policymakers. So we feel much more comfortable subsidizing heat pumps. Just give people money to put in a heat pump, right? What we don't feel comfortable doing, or what policymakers don't feel comfortable doing, is saying, well, if there's too much renewables, why don't we just let that electricity price go to zero or negative for big chunks of the day? Do you know what will happen? People will buy heat pumps and EVs, and companies will figure out business models to enable that.
Thanks, Michael. Anna, I might turn to you, and just as we sort of head towards the end of the conversation, we've talked about the short-term imperative to 2030 and doing the things that we know how to do, just getting on with that. But I think, in a sense, 2030 will never come, right? Because in 2027, 28, we won't be talking about 2030 anymore. We'll be talking about 2035 or beyond. So there's always going to be short-term things, medium-term things, long-term things. And in that context, the superpower ambition is a long-term thing. As your role as a policy director, with the ambition to drive the superpower ambition through your lens, what are those things that are most important for that long term that you're focused on and want to see happen now so that we can start to work towards that?
I think at the moment, the main thing that we've been talking about all year is the need to actually clearly articulate the vision, because at the moment we've got an aspiration as a country to be a renewable energy superpower. Well, what does that actually mean? It means that we've got more electricity and more energy than we need and we can supply the world, and that we're a low-cost location. But in a practical reality, what does it mean in terms of infrastructure investment? Where's it going to go? What communities will it affect? What infrastructure is required? The transmission, the social services around it, the workforce, the supply chain. When you start to look at all of that, the implications are mammoth. Just hydrogen, for example, we think we're very focused on the electricity, and we know we need to get to very low-cost electricity to be competitive on hydrogen. We're not currently low-cost. So that's a big leap that we need to take, and I know it's something that ARENA's very focused on with its driving down the cost of solar, for example. But we've also got to make sure we've got the access to the water and that there's a social compact so that we can actually use that water. So the amount of pieces of the puzzle that we have to put together are long. They're long and many, and at the moment I think what we really need to do is actually articulate what the things are that we want to do. I note that the Grattan Institute last week just put out a report saying probably our 3 green energy exports that really make sense are green iron, alumina, and green ammonia. Like, they're the 3 priority markets. Well, the government just might decide, yes, okay, that's what we're going to do. What does that then look like? Where is that? Where are the locations that make sense? What's the infrastructure that's required? We then need a really, I think, focused plan around those things. And there's massive regional development opportunities associated with it. So it's inherently a great story, but it has very large consequences and potential implications.
It strikes me that, Michael, your comment that you made about the way the world's industrialisation changes and needs to shift, actually, it's like a fractal. You can drill down to Australia, and the same thing applies to Australia, that the things we do in certain locations today in Australia need to shift as well. When I think about even that very large Western Green Energy Hub project, 50 gigawatts of solar and wind down in Western, the lower bottom of Western Australia, there's nobody there at the moment. I mean, traditional owners, obviously, and that's important. But in terms of the infrastructure to even build that facility, you have to build new towns and new hospitals and churches and all the facilities that go with that. It's a real shift in population to drive this transition.
It absolutely is. And, the scary thing is about that, even that project is tiny compared to even existing demand for hydrogen. If you actually look at the global demand, 100 million tons of hydrogen, if you turn that into gigawatts of renewables to deliver it, you're talking about, just to put the scale into context, 1.5 times all wind and solar installed to date would be required just to do existing hydrogen demand. So if you then want to start doing steel and long-duration storage and aviation fuel, and I have this hydrogen ladder, which some of you will know about, if you just want to do the top 2 rows, you would need 6 times all the renewables ever installed anywhere in the world. The scale of it is colossal. So 50 gigawatts sounds big. I hate to say it's small. And yeah, huge implications if Australia wants to play that game. And by the way, I love, steel, alumina, and I would call it fertilizer. I'm old school. For me, all of the other uses of ammonia, shipping and generating power in Japan, are highly unlikely, but we are going to need fertilizer. So I would become very, very focused, and then I would do it, as you say, at massive scale, and think through all of the implications for infrastructure in Australia.
Andrew Forrest would digress.
He knows my email address.
All right, we're going to wrap up, everybody. I'm going to ask the panellists just to give some final comments. And one thing I'd like to hear is how optimistic, pessimistic, or realistic you want to be on this future superpower ambition for Australia.
I think I'm optimistic. I think that Australia is, if anyone is going to transition to net zero, it has to be Australia with the resources that we have, wind, solar, and the the land mass. So I'm optimistic on that front, and I think we have a responsibility to take advantage of that resource to generate green fertiliser. We should be pushing forward for that as fast as possible in order to start decarbonising the rest of the world.
So I'm going to say I'm neither optimistic nor pessimistic, because all of the factors required for the renewable superpower, the deindustrialization of parts of the world and the attraction of those industries here, that's all in place. But I also am aware that Australia is a location. You've got cheap coal, you've got cheap gas, you've got fantastic solar resources, you've got fantastic wind resources, you've got uranium if you want to use it, you've got all the money in the super funds, you've got the incredible resources, and you manage to have some of the most expensive electricity in the world. So it could go either way, which is why this panel is so important, I think.
Hopefully not for long, I think. Let's see. I reckon by the end of this decade we will have very competitively priced power. I'm excited, to be honest. I'm sorry, I'm not going to answer your question, Darren, but I'm excited about the next 6 years. I mean, we have to be. And we have to have some real urgency. Every time I come to a COP, I go home with this sense of how do we convey the sense of urgency that we have to do what we need to do, and that's what makes me get out of bed every day. I think it's what makes most people that come along to COP get out of bed every day, and so I've got a spring in my step, even though I know it's going to be a Herculean task.
So look, I think you have to be hopeful and you've got to stick with your goal and your target. But just finishing on this point about COP, I hope you guys do end up hosting COP31, because you will have the chance to bring the world to Australia and show the world what you have to offer. And yes, there is lots of money in the super funds, but you can always do with more. So you can get the investors there at the same time.
All right, thank you very much. Please, everyone, join me in thanking the panel. Thanks, Richard. Thanks.